Museum of Art. I'm so happy that you're here. I want to tell you a little story. When I was an intern at the Art Institute of Chicago, after having done undergraduate studies in Japanese art at Oberlin College, I had done book learning, but I really wanted to get my hands on some objects. And one day in storage, I was moving artwork from one shelf to another with the curator there, Eleanor Pearlstein, still a dear friend and a colleague in the field. And I picked up a pot from a shelf that said Tang Dynasty. And it looked very odd to me. So I handed it to Eleanor, or I was holding it in my hands and said, "Is this really Tang?" And she said, "I don't know. Hand it to me." And I handed it to her, and she said, "It doesn't feel Tang." And I thought, give me that. I want to know what Tang feels like. What do you mean? I didn't know that there was such a thing as that sort of synesthesia, because when you study academic art history, so much of what you're studying are major monuments, either in a book, on a PowerPoint presentation, if you're lucky, in an art museum through the plex of the case, but you're not fondling them the way that you need to really be able to understand these objects. And I've had a number of mentors in my life. Eleanor was one of them. Certainly my advisor, David Sensabaugh at Oberlin College. The opportunity to study Shang bronzes with Bob Bagley at Princeton, unbelievable. But I think the greatest mentor that I've had has been Robert D. Mowry, our today's speaker. Start from the beginning, I am not a specialist in Chinese or Korean ceramics. But quite honestly, you don't have to be a specialist in this field to appreciate the level of scholarship, the level of precision and acuity that today's speaker brings to this field, and to everything that he does, quite honestly. In addition to being a reborn Ming Dynasty literatus, or perhaps Choson literatus, Bob is just the consummate scholar, amazing connoisseur. Connoisseurship is something that you don't hear enough about in academic art history programs. I'm very happy that here at the University of Oregon you do, because we have art historians, such as some who are sitting in the room right now, who care about original objects. And working at an academic art museum, I think it is so important that students have something to study besides those shadows of objects that you see in books and on PowerPoint presentations. It's a funny way to introduce a PowerPoint presentation, but so be it. But in any case, it is the opportunity to spend 14 years in storage with Robert D. Mowry at the Harvard Art Museums as he handled works of art, taught with works of art, and more to the point, to bring him here to the University of Oregon and have him apply his amazing powers of deduction, his years of hands-on knowledge of these pieces, of Chinese art, of Korean art in general, in all fields. He absolutely blew us away walking through the galleries, talking about Chinese textiles and Korean paintings as well. Has been amazing. Bob is a born teacher. He's an amazing curator. He's done all sorts of special exhibitions. I can't even remember them all. First Under Heaven, a fabulous exhibition of ceramics from the Henderson collection at the Harvard Art Museums. He worked on the Chinese Scholars Studio with James Watt. At Harvard, I was privileged to be there during a time of great productivity, not mine, but his, working on first the Bible of anyone who cares about brown and black Chinese ceramics. Hare's fur, tortoiseshell, partridge feathers, Chinese brown and black ceramics from 400 through 1400. On Chinese Scholars' Rocks, in Worlds Within Worlds, Chinese Scholars' Rocks from the Richard Rosenblum collection, on the Chixing Li collection of modern and contemporary Chinese paintings. Gosh, I can't even remember. Later Chinese bronzes from the St. Louis Art Museum, Chinese textiles in the Phoenix Art Museum. Bob's laser focus is something that I think you will really come to appreciate today as we talk about a little thing, the history of Chinese and Korean ceramics. One note, I think we are going to have discussion perhaps of China first, a break, and then Korea, or is this chronological break?
Cultural break.
Cultural break. So there will be an intermission, and there are restrooms on this floor behind the auditorium. So thank you so much for coming, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to Robert D. Mowry.
Well, good afternoon. I feel like that must have been a paid advertisement, but thank you, Ann Rose. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it was a great privilege to work with Ann Rose for nearly 15 years at the Harvard Art Museums, and then this continuing association in her post here. And so this is, it is wonderful to be here. Now, Ann Rose asked me to do the impossible today. She asked me to treat all of Chinese and all of Korean ceramics, 4,000 years of Chinese ceramics, 2,000 years of Korean ceramics. So we're going to do that. How could I not do what Ann Rose asked me to do? But at the same time, this is the reason that word technique slips in there. There's no way to cover all of these, not only centuries, but millennia, and different cultures and this and that. So what I thought we would do is look at China from the point of view of major developments. In that sense, one can divide it into three major periods of development from a technical point of view. And then Korea is something of a reflection of what happens in China. And so we will see that during the second part of the lecture. But when I say three major periods, if we think about major technical breakthroughs, if we take the period from Neolithic times, say 2500 BC, down through the Han Dynasty, say until the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, we see the perfection of earthenware and the development of stoneware. We'll get to these terms in just a moment. And the stoneware, the development of that, the technical development is so important because stoneware is the foundation of all later Chinese ceramics. And so it's only once that stoneware becomes the foundation of ceramic ware that we have a big breakthrough and move on. But it took 1,000 years to perfect that. But even though they perfected stoneware by the Han Dynasty, they're just beginning to experiment with glazes. So the second great period, another period of 1,000 years, is from the Han Dynasty, say the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, through the Song Dynasty, this great classical era in China. And this is the period when glazes, high-fired glazes, are perfected, culminating in the wonderful monochrome glazed, subtly hued ceramics of the Song Dynasty, the great Celadon tradition. But it's also during that period that the foundations are laid for the succeeding period, which is dominated by porcelain. And so porcelain develops in that middle period, if you will, in the 8th and 9th centuries, but it's just one of a number of different kinds of ceramic ware. But in that third period, right at the beginning of the period, porcelain will come to the fore, sort of push everything else aside. Then you have the evolution of blue and white ware and the great colorful enamel tradition, which is still happening today. Then, with Korea, we see many reflections of that in Korea, but we'll look at some similarities, relationships, and differences. So, this is how we're going to get through two cultures for millennia, and we'll do our best. So let's jump right in. So when we think of Chinese ceramics, we usually think of the highly finished wares. Now, I said for the second period, the culmination is the Song Dynasty with the subtly hued monochrome glazed wares, the high-fired wares, epitomized by this type of ware. This is imperial guan ware, the most refined ceramics of the day in the 12th and 13th centuries, made for use at the imperial court. Or, with China, we think of the blue and white wares, the perfect wares from the Ming Dynasty. This type of ware is court ceramic ware as well. They're not just the finest wares produced in China. They are some of the finest, not some, they are the categorically finest ceramic produced anywhere in the world at this time. And one thing I would emphasize right at the beginning of our talk, that it's important to study ceramics, not just to know what happens in the realm of ceramics and such, but in pre-modern times. And by that I mean pre-scientific revolution, pre-industrial revolution and such. Ceramics are a very, very good indicator or a very good mirror of a particular culture's level of technological sophistication. Because the production of these wares, it's not just the chemistry of the glazes, the chemistry of the bodies, but it shows the mastery of heat. No, I don't mean fire. Every early civilization has fire. But the understanding of the problems of heat and how to control it. That is to say, the problem of a kiln is the same anywhere in the world. The problem is the same as that of a fireplace in the living room. How do you, first of all, get the right temperature, but project the heat into the kiln? How do you project the heat from the fireplace into the room rather than the heat just going up the chimney with the smoke? The Chinese mastered this when no one else in the world did. And it not only shows their level of sophistication with ceramic technology, but it's indicative of their general level of technological sophistication. In fact, the Chinese, from say 1000 BC down to about 1500, were the world's technological leaders. And so the fine ceramic ware that's produced during that period is symptomatic of that. So back to the ceramics, the blue and white ware that we see here, which in the third period then is succeeded by these highly colorful wares of the type that we see here, particularly from the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries and such. And so this is what we will see, survey these types of major developments. In Korea, we also have celadon wares with their own particular characteristics, but done in the shadow of China, if you will, but with their own particular differences. In addition, whereas blue and white ware dominated the sort of early, late period in China, Koreans produced blue and white ware as well, but they also did a lot of brown and white ware, if you will, and we will see the development of that. And then, of course, they also did blue and white ware, but they didn't usually do the very colorful wares, not because it was so difficult, but it was simply a different aesthetic sensibility, much more restrained one than what we see in later China. Now, we'll see this slide several times, so don't worry about writing it all down or memorizing it. But it's just to say that each one of these three periods basically is typified by a particular type of ceramic ware. The earliest period, from Neolithic times down through the Han Dynasty, we see the production of a lot of earthenware. And that's the type of ceramic ware that's produced in every early civilization. Greek vases, for example, are earthenware. Terracotta tiles are earthenware and such. Earthenware uses humble clays, and it's fired at a relatively low temperature. Don't know what happened there. It's still on my screen here. Fired in the range of 800 to 900 degrees centigrade. But at that temperature, the particles of silica do not melt and fuse together. So that, is there a cord that...
Oh, this came out a little bit.
Oh, why don't we screw those in, and then it shouldn't come out again. Or maybe it doesn't want to.
I don't think the computer has
okay, it doesn't have the receptacles. Okay, well, I probably bumped it and it just moved. Okay, well, with luck it'll... Next time we know if it does that again. Anyway, earthenware uses humble clays, and it's fired in the range of 800 to 900 degrees centigrade. You're all familiar with earthenware, whether you realize it or not, but if you have a brick red flower pot at home, not a vase for cut flowers, but just a brick red flower pot for growing plants, that's earthenware. And you know that if you overwater the plant, the exterior of the pot will become moist to the touch due to the porous nature of the earthenware. Stoneware, which really becomes the basis for the middle period that we talk about, uses more sophisticated clays, and it's fired at a higher temperature, in the range of 1100 to 1200 degrees centigrade. And at that higher temperature, the particles of silica in the clay melt and fuse together, so that stoneware is impervious to liquids even without a glaze. So these beautiful glazes that we see on the Song Celadon wares are there basically to make the pots as beautiful as they can be made. And then porcelain uses two very specific clays, both of which are white, and it's fired in the range of 1300 to 1400 degrees centigrade, which is about the upper limit of the temperature that can be reached in a traditional kiln. And again, the particles of silica melt, but the distinctive characteristics of porcelain are that it's white, and because of the high silica content, if the porcelain walls are thin enough and the light is bright enough, of course it's translucent and the light is transmitted through it. So now looking at the early period, these are Neolithic pots produced in the northwest of China. Let's see if we can make this work. Turn this on, push this. No, why isn't this coming on?
There's an on button on the side.
Yeah, I just pushed that. We tried it before and it worked.
Let's see.
Turn it off. Turn it back on. Oh, it's vibrating. There, I think it's working. There we go. Okay.
Okay.
What happened?
There's a light control down there.
Oh, you're going to turn the lights down. That probably helps for looking at the slides. Anyway, pots of the type that I just showed you, the two major areas for Neolithic development, that made it worse. There we go. There.
Cool. Okay.
Will they go down any farther? Even better. Excellent. I think there's enough night in the back and coming in from the doorway that this is fine to have them all up here at the front. Most of the Neolithic developments in China are in the northern part of China. And essentially, there are very strong Neolithic developments in the northwest and then along the east coast. And so pots of the type that I just showed you come from the northwest. And they are characterized by the buff earthenware. So these are porous. They're not glazed. If you, like a flower pot, if you put water or other liquids in them, it will gradually seep through and moisten the exterior. They're not yet using a potter's wheel. These are produced by coiling. Perhaps around some kind of form or just free form, but they take coils of clay, put them around and around, and then smooth the surface. Once they're dry, they decorate these particular types by painting slip over the surface. Now, slip is simply a clay that's ground to a fine powder mixed with water so they can dip a brush in it and paint it on the surface. Once it's dried, in some of them, as you see here, there's a slight luster because they have burnished the surface, probably with a small smooth stone, before the piece is put in the kiln. But it's, even though there's luster, it's not glazed. So that type comes from the northwest, Gansu province, that particular area. They're produced in kilns that look something like this. They're simply from the ones that have been excavated, dug into the side of a small hill, that kind of thing, with the fire down here and the sticks of wood over here, a little chamber for the heat and the smoke to go up, and then the pot's put in there. And you can see how the heat is simply going up with the smoke. But this produces this particular type of earthenware. This shows the action of the fire down below, the heat and smoke coming up through perforations and kind of a boundary there, and the pots up there. And here's a beautiful one here at the University of Oregon in the Schnitzer Museum. One of these from the northwest, probably produced, oh, for some reason cut the bottom off, but probably around, say, 2300 BC. So it's coiled earthenware, the upper portion decorated with designs painted in black and burgundy slips, the surface burnished so it has a certain gloss. These jars tend to be ovoid. The lower portion is usually undecorated. We don't know exactly why, but it's assumed they were probably set into the soil just to keep them stable and such, so there was no need to decorate the lower portion. Indeed, if they did decorate it, it wouldn't be seen. Now, the other major developments in the Neolithic period, where they're perfecting shapes and learning about kilns and firing, along the east coast, particularly in the northeast, Shandong province and that particular area. The Dawanko culture, the Longshan culture, they produce black ones, gray ones, and some rare white ones of the type that you see here. The potter's wheel had been introduced on the east coast by this time, and it's not a fast turning wheel, but a very slow turning wheel, but it means that the pieces are thinner, the walls are thinner than the rather thick-walled ones produced from coiling. These are generally not decorated with any kind of painted designs, but maybe a few incised lines or a few little ribs that you see there, and very interesting shapes. Again, this is typical of the East Coast tradition, particularly the Shandong Peninsula, but also up and down the coast in this general area. So those are the two types that give rise to, that come to the fore in the Neolithic period. Now, when we move into the Shang dynasty, we're dealing with this first real dynasty from around, say, 1600 BC down to about 1050 or so. And the Shang dynasty is best known for these ritual bronze vessels, the great monuments of the day. The reason I bring them in, we often forget about ceramics when we talk about the bronzes, but what we have to remember, and the Shang dynasty is sort of in this area between those two great Neolithic cultures. In this area, the last great capital of the Shang dynasty was there at Anyang, which you see right there on the map. But what we often forget is that the shapes and the functional types of the bronze vessels come out of Neolithic ceramic types. So when you look at these vessels, these very stately late Shang, mature Shang vessels, we realize, oh, yes, they come out of the Neolithic ceramic tradition. That is the shapes and the functions of the vessel. So this type of cooking vessel, it's a vessel for cooking grains to offer to the spirit of deceased ancestors. The form was already there in the Neolithic era. Or when we look at this one, yes, here is a late Neolithic, early Shang dynasty one in ceramic ware, and this is simply copying the form and elaborating on it, both in terms of the shape and the decoration. Or one like this, which is a very distinctive wine heating vessel. It's kind of unusual because the handle is at a 90-degree rotation from the spout rather than a 180-degree rotation, and you see the same thing there in the late Neolithic prototype. Or in something like this. But there's an even more intimate relationship between the bronzes and the ceramics, other than the shapes and the functional type. That is to say, of course, the molds for casting the bronze vessels are ceramic, so that in a sense, the bronzes evolve initially as a subdivision of the potter's art. Who was using fire, who was using heat high enough to melt metal in the first place? The potters. So it would have been the potters who discovered that you could melt little lumps of what just seems to be a little rock. We would think of it as ore today, but goes in accidentally as a little rock, comes out as a little lump of metal. They look at that, they experiment with it, they discover that they can melt metal and create bronze. So the potters would have discovered this, and they were the first ones to cast bronzes. And so this is the way the bronzes were cast in China. A piece mold technique, they were cast upside down in general, but they would make a model in clay of the piece. This is the piece itself, but you see how the various pieces fit together, pour the molten bronze in, and it would be cast. And so, of course, this is the same vessel that I showed you before, but upside down as it would have been in the mold. And here is one fragment of a casting mold. So we realize that the study of the ceramic ware in this period is important for the understanding of the bronzes, as well as the understanding of the ceramic ware. And keep in mind that on decoration like this and the vessels produced during the Great Bronze Age, that all of the decoration that you see here was integrally cast with the vessel itself. This was not chased and chiseled after firing. This was integrally cast with the vessel itself, as you could see from the little designs in the casting mold here. Quite a major accomplishment, particularly when you see it up close like this. Now, up to this point, now the ceramic molds for casting are stoneware. Those Neolithic pots that we were looking at from the northwest, from the east coast, those were earthenware. Here we're moving into stoneware. Like I said before, it uses more sophisticated clays. It's fired in the range of 1100 to 1200 degrees centigrade, at which point the particles of silica melt, creating a ceramic ware that's impervious to liquid, even without a glaze. Now, it's during the Shang dynasty that we first have the emergence of stoneware. Remember, this will become the foundation of the great celadons and the other great wares, but it takes a long time to perfect it. Once the bronzes become the be-all and end-all of the vessel tradition, of course, the vessels begin now these ceramic vessels begin to imitate the bronze vessels in terms of their shapes and their decorative schemes. As you see here, the important thing is that they're able to produce these high-fired ceramic wares. So now you see ceramic ware imitating the bronzes and such. And what allowed the Chinese to produce stoneware was the development of the dragon kilns. That is to say, as I said before, the problem of a kiln is so often that it's built as a small mound, if you will, with a chimney at the top of the center of the dome. And as the smoke goes up, the heat just goes with it. The Chinese had the realization, and now this is of course a later kiln, but this is the way it would develop over time, is if you built it on a small slope and you have the fire down here, you can have additional fires going up there. But if the heat is going to follow the smoke anyway, just let it all travel together and then have a chimney up here. And they could reach high temperatures, they could sustain high temperatures for producing stoneware. Once again, showing the brilliance of the Chinese. Now, the next thing that happens in that period, once they develop stoneware, is to begin to experiment with glazes. Now, these are the very distant forerunners of those beautiful monochrome glazes that I showed right at the beginning of the lecture. But they start with what we call ash glazes. Now, in high-fired ceramic ware, if ash falls on a piece during firing, there's a lot of silica in the clay, and the ash acts as a flux to cause a glaze to form naturally. It will be a little beaded, the color will be odd, this and that, but this is the way glazes were discovered. Now, this is not an accidental or natural ash glaze. This is the result of an applied ash glaze, meaning that they were going to fire this as stoneware. They had learned that if ash falls on a piece during firing, glaze may form, and so they probably coated it, at least the upper portion, with ash, probably ash mixed with a little bit of clay. And after firing, it has glaze over portions of it. The ash glaze is difficult to control. It has a mind of its own. It wants to run, forming all these little beads. Those weren't wanted. They wanted an even, stable glaze, but that's the way these glazes start out. Some of them will be greenish like the last one. Some of them may be brown, as we see here. And here we're jumping 1,000 years, but by the Han Dynasty, they're able to control the ash glazes fairly well. This is a stoneware piece. It's gray stoneware, but in firing it formed kind of reddish brown or russet skin. But they've covered the upper portion with ash to produce the glazes that you see there. So, in this first period, we've covered that first period. They went through a marvelous period of creating the earthenwares with wonderful shapes, as we saw particularly in the black and white pieces. They have developed stoneware. They're using stoneware for casting beautiful bronze pieces. And now at the end of that period, they have perfected stoneware. They're ready to experiment with glazes. And with that, we move into the second great period of technological development with ceramics. Now, those developments that we've talked about up to this point have been up in this general region. Neolithic over there, over here. Many of the developments in the Shang, Zhou, and Han dynasties in that central region there. Ceramic technology and developments in ceramic technology begin to shift down here. We don't know why. There were good clays there. Potters were active there, and for some reason it took off down here. But the development of high-fired glazes really were pioneered in this area. Shanghai is up here on that little point. Hangzhou is down here. And these developments took place just around along the southern shore of Hangzhou Bay. This region, Shaoxing, Ningbo, that general area, Shanglinhu. So the pieces that are coming up now were produced in that area. And here is a little better. You can see in the detail there, in this general area, Hangzhou Bay, and produced in that area along the south shore. And this is what I mean here. This is no longer an ash glaze. This is an applied high silica kind of glaze. They realize that they can produce much more sophisticated glazes by using clay high in silica content. So then the main thing becomes to control the color. Now, the color that we see in these celadons, and we'll define that term in a moment, but the color that we see in celadon ware comes from a small presence of iron oxide in the glaze. To put this in context, first of all, glaze is chemically and physically related to glass, just as the word glaze and glass are etymologically related. That is, a glaze is simply a glassy coating over a ceramic piece. Now, when we think about the glass, if you think about a piece of window glass, for example, not plastic, not plexiglass, but pure glass, you know that when you look through a window, it's clear and it seems completely colorless. But you also know that if you see a piece of broken glass and look at it from the side, there's a slight greenish color to it. And for those of us who are a little bit older, we remember Coke bottles, which have a particular greenish color. This color in window glass, in Coke bottles, in a Celadon glaze, it's all coming from a little bit of iron oxide in the glaze. In window glass, it seems to be colorless, but when you see it from the side, that little color there probably comes from about 0.25% of iron oxide in the glass. In a Celadon glaze like this, it's probably around 2–2.5% of iron oxide, causing this color to form. Why green? Well, it's not that they selected green, it's that because of the iron, and the iron is naturally present in the clay, and it's hard to get out of the clay, not free iron, but iron oxide, there are several different oxides, but an iron oxide in the clay, it's the one that naturally forms on its own. And then to get just the right hue, whether you want it to be an olive green or a bluish green, that became the big challenge. But keep in mind that there are very few coloring agents that can be used for a ceramic glaze that can withstand the high temperature of the kiln and also produce a beautiful color. Iron is one that can do it. In traditional times, as a matter of fact, there are just 3 coloring agents that can produce good color in high-fired wares. Iron, which can produce the greenish color here, and then depending on conditions, it may be bluish green, it may be a more olive green. You can use cobalt, which will produce a beautiful blue, but that will come much later. And you can use copper, which can produce a beautiful red, or it can produce green. But again, that will become much later. So in this period, they're limited to iron, an iron oxide, to get the various colors. And by various colors, I mean whether it's one shade or another of green, or if you increase the amount of iron oxide in the glaze, it can produce, as we'll see shortly, a brown or black glaze. And that was the entire range. Their choice for a long period of time was one or another hue of green, brown or black, or a glaze without any color, which would be clear, and if you put it over whiteware, it will be white. And so then they manipulate this, they manipulate that, as we will see, to get the different varieties of Celadon. And this is why in the final period, when they're able to produce porcelain and realize that they can use cobalt, it's such a huge breakthrough that they're able to produce blue and white, they're able to produce red and white, and a whole expanded palette of colors, that when they finally make that breakthrough in the 14th and 15th centuries, they suddenly just leave all of this old ware behind. We've done everything we could with that, everyone's tired of it, let's move on with something new. And so that's the general the tenor of what happens. But this is the starting point for these Celadon glazed wares. Now, what does Celadon mean? Well, of course, Celadon's a very old, ancient word. It comes into English in the 17th, well, it's revivified, if you will, in the 17th century. In France, there was a play by Dworsky in which there was a character named Celadon, who the script says is supposed to wear silk robes with ribbons and scarves and things like that are sort of a sage green color. And because of that, the name Celadon became associated with that color. But in fact, in Ovid's Metamorphoses, there is a river named Celadon. So it may be that the term has been associated with the sea green color of water since antiquity. But it's just a name. It means a bluish green color. How is it produced in ceramic ware? Well, of course, first of all, it's high-fired ceramic ware. It's going to be on stoneware, could be on porcelain, but it's a bluish green glaze where the principal coloring agent is an oxide of iron, and it needs to be fired in a reducing atmosphere. We'll soon be through all this technology, so don't panic. Reducing atmosphere. There are 2 basic kinds of atmosphere in a kiln. One is an oxidizing atmosphere, and as the name implies, it means that fresh air, basically, with a lot of free oxygen, is brought into the firing chamber, is heated, and pushed into the area where the ceramics are. And what's happened is when we think about kilns, we think about the glaze melting and things like that. But what we often forget is it's not just a matter of glazes melting and such. It's that in that high temperature, all kinds of chemical reactions are taking place. And if there's a lot of free oxygen in the air, one set of chemical reactions will happen. The other type of atmosphere is a reducing atmosphere, and it means that you keep the fresh air out and the smoke and other combustion products from the fire are channeled into the firing chamber where the ceramics are. Now, in a reducing atmosphere, it means that the fire has burnt up all the oxygen, it's used all the oxygen. What you have, of course, is carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. And in the same way that carbon monoxide will kill us because it pulls the oxygen out of us, it pulls the oxygen out of the ceramic pieces and their glazes. And that produces a different set of reactions. And in order to get the cold bluish-green color that becomes so desirable with the celadons, it needs to be that reducing atmosphere. Now, if you have an oxidizing atmosphere, it doesn't mean it's going to be a wildly different color. It's going to be purple or something like that. But if you want the cold bluish-green color, which they will finally get to and perfect after 1,000 years of experimentation, you have to have the reducing atmosphere. If you have an oxidizing atmosphere, like I said, it won't be wildly different, but instead of being bluish-green, it'll be olive, yellowish-green, something like that, and not as attractive. The big challenge for them was basically understanding what was going on, how to control the kiln to keep fresh air out. Very difficult to keep fresh air out of things, and so they had to figure out how to do that, and that was the great challenge. But this is the starting point with light gray stoneware and glazes of that type. Here you see another one, 3rd to 4th century. They tend to leave in these pieces the bottom portion free, not because anyone wants a partially glazed ceramic piece, no. But remember, there's still problems with the stability of the glaze. It wants to run. It's melting in the kiln. It wants to run down. That if the glaze runs down to the base of the piece, it may fuse the piece to the kiln furniture, in which case you try to remove it. The piece may be ruined, you may damage the bottom, it may not be able to contain liquids and such. So they're dealing with many challenges. They know how to produce stoneware, that's not a problem. The big challenge now is the glaze. The stability of the glaze, the evenness of the glaze, and the color of the glaze, and it will take 1,000 years to perfect that. In some cases in the early period, that is this 3rd, 4th century period, they may well take the glaze all the way down into the bottom to something that was intended to be expensive in its own day. It means that the underside is unglazed and that they set it on some kind of little stilt, we call them spurs, to support the piece. But even then, if the glaze is too viscous and runny, it may cause problems. Now, for reasons I don't, new software is available from Apple. I'm glad to know that. How do we get rid of that? Okay, now, are you going to advance? There we go. Okay, now, as I said, they also, this is the type of wear that we were looking at before, and this would have been fired on little supports known as spurs. But you see how the glaze has run down. It's pooled at the bottom where the gravity pulled it down during firing. But my point is they're interested already in an expanding palette of colors, but they're limited to iron as a coloring agent. But they learn that if they add more iron oxide as a coloring agent, it will go from the celadon hue to the brown hue that we see here. And this will lead to the brown and black glazes of the type that they produced numbers of in the Song period. So that the celadon glazes and the brown glazes are like siblings. It's just that there is more iron oxide in it. The more iron that's in the glaze, the more difficult it becomes to control. And you can see how uneven the glaze is there. And so these are all challenges that they face and have to learn to control in order to produce the perfect wares of, say, 500 or 600 years after this. When we see these black glazes, they really are dark brown glazes. Here, that's very apparent. Later on, they appear to be black, but in fact, they're looking black in reflected light. In transmitted light, they're actually very, very dark brown. I refer to them as black coffee brown glazes. Now, so those kinds of wares were being produced down here. In the 6th century, we have the spread of that kind, the taste for those kinds of wares and the desire to produce them shifting to the north. Now, that is to say, they continue producing wares here, but we begin to have a number of kilns in the north experimenting with the production of those wares. And that's important because for the Song dynasty, many of the most famous wares are produced in the north, where I just showed you. Not by these kilns that are coming to be in the 6th century, but by their successors. And so you can see this looks much like the type that we have just been looking at with the unglazed stoneware down here. But it's early in the tradition of these northern kilns, and they're still really dealing with problems of glaze stability, like the drip that you see there. In some ways they control it. The pie crust rim that we see here, such a wonderful feature, a nice decorative feature dividing the pot into upper portion, lower portion, but it's basically there to help control the flow of the glaze as it melts. You can see how it's been running down. Largely it pools there. Without that, it probably would have made it all the way to the bottom. Keep in mind that to our eyes in the 20th and 21st century, we like the appearance of these strips. Probably to the people who produced this pot, they were crestfallen that the glaze didn't stop there and instead ran down in these teardrops that we see here. Hard to know for sure, but we're quite certain they didn't want that. At their best, whether from the south or from the north, they would look like this, with the glaze pooling nicely there. These various ribs here controlling the flow of the glaze, but also with the glaze pooling in those areas, really enlivening the surface of the pot in a very attractive fashion. And some kilns were producing both the celadon wares and the dark wares. And even though this one is a ewer with the handle here, you can see it's about the same pot, probably produced about the same time by the same kiln. And so you can see how close they are. It's just that this one has more iron oxide in the glaze. This is one of those that's brown, which you can sense if you look here, but in reflected light, beginning to look black. Now, the previous one that I showed you where the glaze was so mottled was probably 4th century. Here, by the 6th century, you can see that they're getting much better color, much more even, homogeneous nature to the glaze, and it's still a little bit difficult to control, so they leave the bottom of the piece unglazed. But you can see just by looking the advances that are taking place. What we don't usually see today, what we don't usually see in museums, are the pieces that failed. Or the ones that look like this. Believe me, there were plenty of those too. They just haven't been preserved as works of art, and so we seldom see them. But this shows you the kinds of problems that they were confronting. The ones that we see today are the ones that turned out correctly, or almost correctly. But there were probably just as many, if not more, of the ones that look like this. Other problems. Today we look at this and we think, oh, what a marvelous blue on there. Once again, they were probably crestfallen when pieces like this came out of the kiln. They wanted an even, homogeneous, beautiful bluish green color, not a green piece with blue streaks in it. Now, where did that come from? Well, this comes because of ash falling on the piece during firing. Now, with the unglazed pieces, the ash could cause a natural or accidental ash glaze to form. But when you've already applied a glaze slurry and then you fire it, if ash falls on a celadon glaze, it will typically cause these areas of blue to form. And so again, it's sort of attractive to our eyes, but probably not something they wanted. But the Chinese were always wonderful at turning lemons into lemonade, so to speak, and they realized that, hey, we want broader scheme of colors. Here's a way we can do it. And so they don't want blue splashes on a celadon glaze, but they realize, well, hey, if ash produces blue spots on a celadon glaze, maybe it'll produce blue spots on a brown glaze. So they realized that, they developed it, so they take the dark brown glaze and they probably mix ash with some body clay or glazed clay and apply it to the surface, meaning they're getting two different colors. So you see these kinds of experiments happening particularly in the 9th century. Here we're jumping way ahead, but it's that kind of experimentation that realizing that, gee, if we mix ash with a brown glaze, if we mix ash with a celadon glaze, we can create blue. that will result in this kind of Juneware in the Song dynasty. And so it's one experimenting with this, having a mistake over there, figuring out what caused the mistake, how to exploit it to produce something very beautiful like this. So these things are completely interlinked from one to the next. But going back, then they realized, well, before we get to the Juneware and the blue glazes and things like that, how do we prevent the ash from falling on the glaze? And so they developed the idea of saggers. And of course, this is something that misfired, but because of that, we have the sagger here. Saggers are ceramic firing containers. And so in some cases, they're sort of large, they're kind of cumbersome, but they serve two functions. One is simply protecting the piece in the kiln from ash or other combustion products that might fall on the piece during firing, producing unwanted colors or black spots or other mars on the surface of the glaze. The other thing, in these high temperatures, of course, it's not controlled by thermostats or anything like that. When they put more wood into the kiln, and some kilns, most were fired by wood, a few that I'll point out were fired with coal, but most with wood. But when you put more fuel into the kiln, remember these have to be fired for hours and hours, big pieces sometimes for a couple of days. When you put more wood in, the temperature is going to go up. It's going to fluctuate a little bit. Now, it's that fluctuation, well, at least that's one of the things that can cause warping, slumping, splitting, breaking, collapsing, all kinds of things like that. So the thick walls of the sagger help to insulate the pieces inside the sagger from fluctuations in kiln temperature, thereby helping to keep them their shape more regular. Now, when you see something like this, what happened? Well, obviously something went wrong and it fell over, but that reminds us that these kilns are not artistic studios, so to speak. The kilns are great manufactories, like kilns today that are producing dinnerware and things like that. They're trying to produce a huge number of pieces, and they're operating as a business, if you will. The bottom line is to produce wares of very, very high quality, but making a profit. Now, of course, they're producing huge numbers of pieces. Lots of people are involved, from those who do the potting, to those who do the glazing, to those who do the firing, this and that. We don't know in, say, the 8th, 9th, 10th century exactly how things work, but we know from written sources a little bit later that, in general, the rate of inefficiency, as it's politely termed, meaning the rate of failure, was about 50%. That is to say, you stack the pieces up, and these saggers would be stacked in a kiln. Keep in mind, because of the high temperatures, everything is expanding. And as they expand, you might have a whole line of saggers that fall over. If they fall over and there are many different stacks of saggers, it'll be a domino effect. And it might be that everything falls over and everything is fused. The ceramics to their saggers and everything is just lost. Now, it doesn't typically happen that everything is lost. In some, it may be a perfect firing, and others it may be 100% loss. But the rate of failure was around 50%. Now you begin to understand why it was that they would leave the lower portion of a pot unglazed in that early period of development. They have enough problems with things that they can't control. For things they can control, they're going to take every measure they can to do it. But this is just to show you a sagger. This is a different kiln, one of the Juneware with the blue glazes. They're all fired in saggers. Some of them are saggers where the pieces are right side up. In some kilns, this is just a diagram, but in some kilns, they have little steps on the inside, if you will, and pieces are fired upside down, one nested above the other, which again, because profit the bottom line is profit, they have to operate the kilns as efficiently as they can, getting as many pieces in, using the fuel efficiently. Let's see, now, continuing that Celadon development, again, we have the kilns in the north, but still the leading kilns in the 8th, 9th, 10th century are the ones there. And by the 10th century, you have pieces where the glazes are stable. They're beginning to decorate the pieces with incised and carved decoration, as we see there, or in this one, sort of imitating a gold or silver bowl with the carved rising lotus petals on the exterior. Now, there are also in the 9th century, we have the invention of porcelain up in this area. And so the beginnings of whiteware, high-fired whiteware, as we see here. Now, once porcelain's invented, it doesn't become the be-all and end-all. It's just one of a number of subtly hued monochrome glazed ceramics. But it's in this period that the whiteware tradition is coming into being, is being perfected, and the celadon ware tradition is being perfected. So porcelain, as I mentioned before, uses two specific clays. When fired together in the range of 1300, 1400 degrees centigrade, they produce a translucent white ware. So these are examples of early porcelain, 8th, 9th century. When we get to the Song dynasty, in this era where the monochromes culminate, this is an example from the 11th to early 12th century, so-called dingware. It's simply the location of the kilns, but often with incised or carved decoration. That's an original firing flaw, even though it would have been in a sagger. Somehow a little bit of ash got in there and caused that little spot to form. Another one, the wares are very subtle from the Song dynasty, the beautiful ivory hue that we see here. This is the underside of that same piece. Here is a bowl. The reason they have metal rims from this particular kiln is that they're fired upside down. Remember the sagger diagram that I showed you? If you fire it upside down, the rim has to be unglazed, otherwise it'll be fused to the sagger. So what do? No one wants an unglazed rim either, so they would band them with metal. Now these are replacements, but still, it was originally banded with metal. In the 12th century, again, they're moving towards ever more efficient production, not only towards more colors, but towards more efficient production. Beginning in the 12th century, they begin to do a lot of molded decoration. The molds, and I'll show you one in a little bit, but the molds are fired ceramic ware. You press the clay over it while it's turning on the potter's wheel, so that the mold shapes the piece basically, determines the exact diameter of the piece, which is useful if you want to produce sets of identical pieces. But the potter's hands pushing the clay against the mold while it's turning on the wheel determines the thickness of the wall and shapes the exterior. But it's the mold that's transferring the decoration. And the underside of that piece, and by firing them upside down, resting on the lip, they're able to glaze the bottom of the foot ring as well, which was considered a very desirable thing. The celadons also come to fruition during this period, and here is, we won't go into all the different kilns, but just notice that in the culmination of the second-rate period are the monochrome hued glazes, often with carved or incised decoration, ones like this, and this is the result of 1,000 years of development from those early pieces. Here is one that's done with a mold. They're so-called hump mold because they're kind of like a hump. They're not pushed together, a two-faced mold. It sits in the center of the potter's wheel, and the piece is shaped over it, the potter pushing the clay against the mold with his hands. And this is also the period where they expand the range of colors as much as they can using the materials at hand. That is to say, the iron oxide, adding ash to the glaze here, as we see, to produce the beautiful blues. Even here, sometimes they will use little copper filings, which when applied to the surface of that glaze, cause purple splashes to form in the areas that received the copper glaze. And then the most refined wares produced in that period were the so-called roux ware, produced in the first part of the 12th century. Very elegant pieces. Most of the pieces from the Song dynasty take the shape of a form in nature. So when you look down on this, it's a cup stand, which is to say a very elaborate saucer. It follows the shape of an open blossom, with the notches separating one petal from the next, and that division further emphasized by the little raised line that comes down there. One of the most famous of the roux ware pieces, the bowl with the cusped rim in the National Palace Museum, or this censer taking the form of an ancient bronze vessel, which is in the Palace Museum in Beijing. Now, in 1127, the Jin Tartars overran the northern part of China. Becomes a separate dynasty. The legitimate Chinese court flees from Kaifeng, the old capital, down here to Hangzhou, coincidentally where the ceramics used to be produced, the early celadons and such. The emperors of the Song dynasty rule an area sort of half what it used to be before. This is their court ware that was produced for them, one of the most refined ceramic wares ever produced. It has a dark slate gray body and a very, very thick bluish green glaze or a grayish blue glaze that you see there. The glaze is so thick that it's difficult to keep crackles from forming, and so they probably weren't wanted, but when they couldn't avoid them, they learned how to develop them into an interesting abstract pattern in their own right. And these are typical of the Guan or imperial wares from the 12th and 13th centuries. And in this perfect tradition of these monochromes that are so refined, you have the celadons produced at the Longquan kilns, which are exceptionally beautiful as well, often taking on forms of bronze vessels or jade implements like that. Now, this great development, we've seen porcelain developing. The great development at the end of the second period is porcelain. These are produced wares of this particular type at the kilns at Jingdezhan. Jingdezhan is here in northeastern Jiangxi province up in this area. And this would become the great ceramics capital, not only of China, but of the world, producing very, very high quality porcelains. They begin to do this. They had a long history. They begin to produce fine porcelain of this particular type with a sky blue glaze, sometimes with incised or carved decoration, and then ones with molded decoration. And this type of porcelain will become the basis for the blue and white ware, which we'll get to very, very shortly here, for example. Now, remember that during the Song dynasty and for 1,000 years leading up to that, the taste had been for the monochrome celadons, the subtly hued wares. In fact, that was all that they were able to produce. And they expanded that palette and began to develop the porcelain. And then suddenly, beginning in the 14th century, they learned that they can paint with cobalt to produce this kind of design on that white ware. Now, how did this happen? Well, as we saw in the 9th century, they had invented porcelain. They were already using cobalt in low-fired glazes in the 8th century, but not so much with high-fired glazes, or here too. These are low-fired earthenware pieces with a cobalt glaze, or sometimes they would use cobalt splashed on a low-fired piece. They did some experimentation in the 8th and 9th centuries with cobalt on porcelain. But it didn't catch on. In the realm of the aristocratic, the imperial taste, this and that, this was probably considered much too garish, and it just didn't catch on. But where it did catch on, some of these types of pieces, Chinese porcelain from the 9th century with cobalt on it, it caught on in Iraq. And this is a piece produced in Iraq in the 9th century. It's not porcelain, it's very low-fired earthenware. But inspired by what we just saw, Inspired by what we just saw, they were producing stylized floral designs like this on low-fired ware. That would develop in Iraq, in that part of the world, and then over the Silk Route and with the great Mongol conquests in the 13th and 14th century, the concept of blue and white ware was reintroduced to China. That is, the palette, not it was low-fired ware coming from the West, but the idea, the palette, introduced to China in the 14th century. And it suddenly takes off as they begin to decorate porcelain with these designs. Much of this early blue and white ware that is from the 14th century is made for export. And when you look there, which I have in a detail, there is a little inscription in probably pseudo-Arabic script, for example. We can recognize that it's supposed to be that type of script, but alas, the person who wrote it didn't quite know the language, and we can't read it. But it tells us that this really was for export. That's the underside of the piece. The base is usually left unglazed in pieces like this so that it can be fired. It's in a sagger, but can rest on its own foot ring. So this is taking that pale, the porcelain with the pale blue glaze that we saw before, but instead of decorating it with incised or molded decoration, they're simply painting with a cobalt blue solution, then glazing it and firing it. This is some of the most famous, these porcelain vases. There are two of them, originally from an altar set. They're in the David collection in London. And these are unusual because they are the only known 14th century blue and white vessels with dated inscriptions. Each one has an inscription on the back side, if you will, where the rising leaves are there. The 14th century pieces tend to have very bold decoration, the aquatic decoration that we see here. Often they're divided into numerous horizontal registers, as we see here. And we'll see it simplified into kind of an all-over design when these become imperial wares in the Ming Dynasty. They were also, like I said, this taste for an expanding palette. They suddenly discover, well, gee, if we can put cobalt under the glaze, what else can we put under the glaze? And they begin to experiment with copper. But copper is very, very difficult to control, both to have lines that, well, shapes that have a hard edge and hold their shape, if you will, but also to get the right color. And the right color is sort of the strawberry jam red. These are from the 14th century, but show them they were experimenting with underglazed copper as well as cobalt. In the 14th century, it's often kind of a grayish mauve color. Sometimes they hold their design, sometimes they don't. But then in the 15th century, blue and white porcelain becomes the most preferred ware at the imperial court. It becomes the be-all and end-all. Porcelain, blue and white porcelain, and porcelain with other colored designs. And it's this kind of ware that basically signals the death knell for that produced at other kilns. They don't immediately go out of business. They fight to stay in business, fight to produce their wares, but the blue and white ware takes over and really becomes the standard for the entire world. And this kind of meticulously painted, beautifully executed blue and white ware becomes the norm in the 15th, 16th centuries, particularly in the Ming Dynasty. When you compare the two, the 14th century, before when it was more an export ware than anything else, or the 15th century wares, you see the spontaneity of the 14th century pieces and how meticulously executed it is once it becomes an imperial ware in the 15th century. Or this beautiful dragon jar in the Metropolitan Collection in New York, the unification of the surface, when we compare it with the 14th century piece, put them side by side, the division into horizontal registers that typifies the 14th century, the more spontaneous painting of that era, the very unified surface, the unified composition, the meticulous painting that comes to the fore as it becomes an imperial ware. Or this type of thing from later in the 15th century. Underglazed red, as I said, is difficult to control to get exactly the right color. Often it shades to a gray instead of turning the strawberry jam red. They treat them, in terms of firing, the same as the underglazed cobalt blue pieces, the base left unglazed and such. Here's one that's completely gray. This is not a black and white photograph. It's a color photograph. But that the copper is so difficult to work with. Another problem is sometimes it bleeds instead of holding a fine line or a hard edge. Here is one where they get the color right from the early 15th century, but once again it's kind of blurry because of its tendency to bleed. All of that is just to say, in this period as well, they discover the best thing to do with copper is not to follow the designs of the underglazed cobalt blue designs, but to silhouette, in this case a pomegranate. They may use a peach, they may use a fish, but to silhouette a particular design element against the otherwise unembellished ground. If there's a little bit of variation in the color, if it bleeds a little bit, it only enhances the effect. So they're constantly trying to get things exactly right, but when they won't behave, when there is a mistake, they learn from the mistake and come up with something new. Using copper, they also realized that in the same way they could mix cobalt with a glaze to produce a blue glaze, they learned that they could mix copper with the glaze and produce a brilliant red, a so-called sacrificial red glaze. Then they learn about overglazed enamels. Now, the basic glaze colors are clear or celadon, or you mix cobalt with it, you get a blue glaze. You mix copper with it, if things come out right, you get a beautiful red glaze. But those were the only colors they could produce. But they learned about overglazed enamels. Enamel is just a term for a low-firing glaze. When this came out of the kiln, after its primary porcelain firing, it was pure white, no color at all. Then they add yellow enamel. Again, it's a low-firing glaze with a yellow color. They put it over the high-fired glaze, fire it a second time. The low-temperature firing melts the enamel, fuses it to the surface of the glaze, but because it's a lower temperature, it in no way affects the high-fired glaze. And with this, they're really able to broaden the palette. With something like this, when this came out of the kiln after its primary porcelain firing, it was a blue and white piece. They added yellow enamel to the background areas, refire it at a lower temperature, and you have a yellow and white piece. The palette seems a little bit unusual to our eyes, but remember that blue and white ware was the most preferred ware at the imperial court. In China, yellow was the imperial color, in the same way that purple was the imperial color in the West, and so how perfect to have the imperial yellow combined with blue and white. Here you see not exactly a before and after, but more or less. When this came out of the kiln, it looked like that after its primary porcelain firing. The yellow enamel added just to the background areas, and just to the background areas because if you put it over the blue, it will look black, as these lines sort of look black around there. And then that opened the door to all kinds of things. The underglazed copper was so difficult to control, but they learned that they could create a red enamel using iron oxide, and red enamel is very easy to control. All kinds of hard edges, fine lines, and things like that. And so that meant for a long time they didn't use underglazed copper red. This is a wonderful piece here in the galleries at the Schnitzer Museum. A little bit later, this is from the, from the 18th century, but it's exactly the same technique that we saw before. It's an underglazed cobalt blue decorated piece, yellow enamel added to the background, and here's a detail where you can see it really is just in the background. The plum blossoms that you see here, the enamel comes right up to the outline, or here's a little area right there. You can always find it on these pieces. Well, it's the top of the bird's beak, but just above that, a little area where they didn't manage to put the enamel, and you can see the glazed white porcelain underneath. Now, of course, what that leads to is they realize that they can combine different colors on the same piece. So here is a piece, an early polychrome piece, where you have the underglazed cobalt blue, the addition of the yellow enamel, and green enamel. That will lead to yellow, green, and red in combination with underglazed blue. As time develops, they learn that they can put a red enamel on top of the yellow enamel to get orange. And this kind of very pictorial scene. And that leads in the Qing dynasty in the 18th century to these very beautiful polychrome enamel pieces like this, where there's no underglazed cobalt blue at all. When it came out of the kiln, it was pure white, no decoration whatsoever. Then they do all of the painting in various hues of enamel. Another thing that happens, this is the one area, or one of the very few areas where there is a technical influence from the West. You'll remember that the Italians, and particularly the Venetians, had been wonderful producers of glass. And they had come up with many different colors, including a pink glass. That rose-hued glass that was produced at Murano around Venice came from the addition of colloidal gold. It simply means powdered gold to the glass mixture. And via the Jesuit missionaries who happened to be in China, that little bit of knowledge was transmitted to the Chinese. They learned that if they mixed powdered or colloidal gold with a clear enamel, it would produce the pink color. The other thing that happened, they realized up to this point, the enamels have all been clear. That is, well, not opaque, just completely clear. They learned that if they add a little bit of tin oxide to the enamel, they could opacify it. So then, they could, if they could opacify it, they could create shading, as you see in those areas. And once they could create shading, they could impart a sense of three-dimensionality, a sense of volume. As soon as they were able to do that, then these paintings often imitate paintings on paper and silk, as we see here. So the ceramic decoration becomes a translation into ceramic decoration of paintings on paper and silk. So that takes us through how many millennia? 4 millennia, 5 millennia of China. Now we're going to break, and then we'll look at Korea after that. Thank you.
So we are ready for part 2, and I must say I was so verklempt introducing Bob before that I neglected to thank our very gracious sponsors. So I have to say, not only is this something that the Schnitzer Museum of Art has been absolutely overjoyed to be able to offer to you, but we have been helped in this endeavor by two of our most important colleagues on campus, those being the Confucius Institute here at the University of Oregon and the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies, for which this is a Jeremiah Lecture Series lecture. So apologies to the powers that be, sorry about that. As you may know now, there's a reason why we call fine ceramics China. And I'm so glad that Bob has been able to explain this. But now we move on to the Korean tradition. And hopefully we will talk not just about the tradition in general, but a few lovely objects that we discovered during our survey over this past week. So with that, take it away.
Thank you, Ann Rose. Okay, well, we'll move on to Korea now, as Ann Rose said. We don't have quite as many millennia to cover, maybe two. But it'll go more quickly because we have the terminology in place, we have all the background about stoneware and those kinds of things in place. So these things will, and you know the Chinese references already. So these will, this portion of the lecture will go more quickly. Even though if we do have a lot of slides. Now, I think everyone in this audience knows exactly where Korea is, but in case there is anyone new to the study of Asia, Korea, of course, is a peninsula in Northeast Asia. China over here, Beijing is over there, Korea, Japan, sort of a closing parenthesis over here. The red line that you see running through there, of course, is the 38th parallel, which until the end of World War II didn't mean much of anything, but since World War II has unfortunately divided Korea into South Korea, the Republic of Korea, and North Korea there. If you're wondering where the 38th parallel is in relation to the United States, on the East Coast it runs through Charlottesville, Virginia. In the middle of the country it runs more or less near Wichita, Kansas, the Oklahoma-Kansas border. And on the West Coast it runs through San Francisco. And so that sort of locates it from the point of view of latitude. Now, I didn't give you a list of Chinese dynasties because any of you not familiar with them would have been running out of the room with all the names, dates, and everything else. But compared to China, Korea's list of dynasties is mercifully short. Apart from Neolithic period and things like that, there are basically four periods. The Three Kingdoms period, obviously the peninsula before any kind of unification, three basic kingdoms and a fourth, the Kaya Confederacy, which wasn't quite as politically unified as the others, but traditionally 57 BC down until 668 when the Shilla kingdom has finally conquered the others and brings for the first time unity to the peninsula. It's succeeded by the Koryo dynasty from 918 to 1392. And of course, the Koryo dynasty is more or less contemporaneous with the Song and Yuan dynasties in China, so that it's during this period that we have the development of the great Korean celadons alongside the development of the Chinese celadons, but also the beginnings of porcelain manufacture, the same as they had been in China. And then the Joseon dynasty, the last of the royal dynasties, from 1392 to 1910, more or less contemporaneous with the Ming and Qing periods in China. And so in Korea, in like manner, you have the taste for porcelain, other things too, but I mean, in terms of simplifying it to make everything fit into a lecture like this, we just focus on the porcelain tradition. Now, just to give a little bit of tenor of the times, in the Three Kingdoms period, we will look mainly at developments in the southeast in the Shilla kingdom. And of course, it's a period that's characterized, if you will, at the royal and aristocratic level, at least, with a taste for gold, the kind of gold crowns embellished with jade ornaments and such, a type very different from what we see in China. That is to say that the Korean culture is a very different culture from Chinese culture, although in the same way in England, after the Norman conquest of 1066, you have an overlay of continental culture. English becomes an amalgam of Germanic Anglo-Saxon language with an overlay of French vocabulary, a Latinate vocabulary and things like that. During the Three Kingdoms period, all kinds of Chinese influences will begin to come in, but they're an overlay on a native Korean civilization, and we will see something of that interplay. But for the Three Kingdoms period, and particularly for Silla, this kind of gold crown or these kinds of gold earrings with the beautiful gold beadwork that you see over the surface, quite different from what we saw in China, but also indicative of a very high level of cultural, artistic, and technological skill. In the Three Kingdoms period, Buddhism had been introduced from China, so that in the Three Kingdoms period, the architecture, the sculpture is very much Chinese in style. In addition, Chinese-style writing had been introduced. But the ceramic tradition looks quite different from the contemporaneous ceramics produced in China at the same time. Despite the wave of Chinese influence coming in, the Korean ceramic tradition seems to be somewhat more resistant to outside influence, probably because the Korean ceramic tradition was a very ancient tradition. It stretches back into the Neolithic era. We're not going to look at Neolithic ceramics, but stretches back into the Neolithic era, was firmly established, and therefore was more resistant to outside aesthetic influences coming in. By contrast, Buddhism was newly introduced to Korea in the 4th century, and so naturally, Buddhist architectural styles from China, Buddhist sculptural styles from China, of course, flooded in and were adopted. So one of the things that we will see in the course of the 7th and 8th centuries is the adoption of a Chinese aesthetic in the ceramic tradition. But the typical ceramics from Jilla, from Kaya, in the 5th and 6th centuries, there are all kinds of jars. There are the pedestal bowls or pedestals cups, often with a cover, as you see here. Now, something to keep in mind is that these are stoneware. These are not earthenware. The Koreans have already progressed beyond the earthenware, which they produced in the Neolithic and early historic period, and by the 5th and 6th centuries are producing stoneware. It's probably under Chinese influence that they learned to produce stoneware, but the thing to keep in mind is that in the 5th and 6th centuries, particularly in the 5th century, the only peoples in the entire world who were producing stoneware were the Chinese and the Koreans. This shows you the very high level of technological sophistication on the part of the Koreans very early on. The Japanese would learn to make stoneware, that is the technology of stoneware manufacture, from the Koreans in this general period. So it's the transmission is from China to Korea and on to Japan. And in fact, the earliest Japanese stonewares, called sueki ware, look very much like the Korean stonewares of this type. So even though it's not glazed, it is technologically very highly sophisticated. Here is an example, one in the Schnitzer Museum, of exactly the same type. Excuse me, light gray stoneware. The slightly darker areas that you see there, simply it forms a skin during firing. Were you to see a chip, and thank heavens there is not a chip, you would see that inside it's a very light, almost a dove gray. Here you see little beads of natural ash glaze or accidental ash glaze that formed during firing as some ash fell on the piece during firing. In the same way that in the 5th and 6th centuries in China, ceramics are not yet fired in saggers. The use of saggers in China and in Korea too comes along later. This period they're stacked in the kiln but not in saggers, and so ash is able to fall on them. You see in Korea there's a taste right from the beginning for open work designs when they're able to incorporate them. Not in the container portion, of course, but in the high pedestal that we see here. And that is something that is much loved in Korea. They also produce jars, some of them round-bottom jars, some of them jars of this particular type. Even those will often be set on a circular base, perforated with the little windows or apertures that you see here. We don't actually think that they are functional. We think they're just decorative, but we don't know for sure. The only way to know something for certain about something like that is for there to be written records from the period with people saying, this is what we did, this is why we did it, and this is what it means. They were writing, Chinese-style writing at the time, but they were not writing about things like this, so we don't know for sure. The pieces typically, if they're decorated, are decorated with abstract or geometric designs, as we see here. Little circles, cross-hatching, things like that. Occasionally there may be a little bit of representational decoration, but in general it's abstract and geometric. Now, that sets the tone. Already 5th and 6th centuries, they're able to produce stoneware. This is the essence. If you want to produce celadon ware, you have to be able to produce high-fired ware. You have to be able to produce it a sustained production. Now, my point here is in 668 with this map, 668 Shilla, which had originally been down in this area in the southeast, unifies this portion of the peninsula, becomes a powerful kingdom in its own right. The northern part, stretching into what is today part of China, Mongolia and such, becomes the Pare kingdom, but one that is not as distinguished as the Shilla kingdom in terms of artistic production. Buddhism continues to be important. In fact, it is the state religion. And great Buddhist monuments, such as the constructed cave temple at Sackler, are created. Again, it's just to set the tenor of the times. In terms of ceramic production, this is where we begin to see Chinese artistic and aesthetic influence, apart from technological influence coming in. They're already producing stoneware, but what we see here, this is 7th century. It's contemporaneous with the Tang dynasty in China. And aesthetically, in the Tang dynasty, the emphasis in terms of form tended to be upon the geometry of the form, full rounded forms, for example. So here we see the form becoming, in this particular instance, a large round form, the bowl and the cover each being hemispherical and forming a nice globular shape when put together. But also notice the base. It's no longer the tall pedestal base that we had before. It's becoming a very short base that's going to be transformed into a Chinese-style foot ring. And in addition, the little apertures that were so prominent before here are becoming almost vestigial. And so the transformation is in progress, if you will. The other major development that we see in the unified Shilla period, here from a 9th century example, is the introduction of glazing. Now, we don't find any kind of widespread use of glazing, but in the same way that we see shapes beginning to be transformed, we see an interest in an applied glaze as opposed to any kind of natural glaze. And here you see a detail with the brownish glaze over the surface and the use of all kinds of little stamped designs as decoration. Here we will leave behind that early period and move on to the Korea dynasty. In 918, Korea, the family establishes the dynasty with its capital, what is today Kaesong, just across the 38th parallel in North Korea today. But that was the capital during Korea. By 935, they had completely vanquished Shilla, and this is the Korea dynasty. As I mentioned before, it is coeval with the Song and Yuan periods, and we see a real wash of Chinese influence coming in. It too is a Buddhist kingdom with Buddhism as the state religion, and by the 14th century, some of the most exquisite of all Buddhist paintings are being produced. The Bodhisattva Kwanseum in Korean, or Guanyin in Chinese. Seated here, the delicacy of the clothing, the transparency of the veil, for example, is really quite amazing that you see there. But it typifies the refinement of the period, as does this type of indigo paper sutra, with the frontispiece painted in gold ink, the text in silver ink. And when we say silver or gold ink, it refers to powdered gold mixed with glue or powdered silver mixed with glue. Of course, these are done in China and Japan as well, but the Korean ones rank amongst the most elaborate and the most beautiful of these sutras on indigo dyed paper. Now, as we had seen, the major early developments for Celadon manufacture were in this area. The great Celadon kilns in Korea were in the southwest. There had long been maritime trade between those two areas, and so the Koreans were importing and knew about the very finest Celadon wares early on. But Koreans, as today, tend to know about the finest things in the world, how to acquire them, and how to replicate them. So this we saw before. This is a 10th century Yue Celadon produced in that area around Hangzhou. And it's this type of ware that becomes the inspiration for the development of the Celadons in Korea. So when we look at, and again, a map just showing that the area where the Celadons were produced is this area, not just because there had been contact and maritime trade, but the area over here happened to have the very best clay for the production of Celadon wares. So naturally, it was in that area where those wares were produced. Now, I'm not showing you the long period, a century or two, of experimentation and evolution and development, but certainly by the late 11th and 12th century, the Koreans were able to produce exquisite Celadon wares, as you see here in this particular image. What I would emphasize right from the outset is that Korean Celadon wares, at their very best, are every bit the aesthetic and technical equal of the very best Chinese ceramics of the day. Of course, the quality varies in Korea, quality varies in China. But at their very best, the Koreans are every bit the equal of the Chinese. What we have to acknowledge is that the Celadon ware was invented, developed, pioneered, and perfected in China. The Koreans learned this from the Chinese and then were able to perfect it on their own, as we see here. But also keep in mind that in the same way that in the 5th century or so, the Koreans and the Chinese were the only peoples in the world, and then by the 6th century, the Japanese, the only peoples in the world who were able to produce stoneware. In the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, the Koreans and the Chinese were the only ones in the entire world who were able to produce these beautiful Celadon wares. It's not just a matter of taste, as we've already seen, it's a matter of technological sophistication and ability. We've already seen that the Chinese were some of the world's technological leaders, as were the Chinese, coming right in behind, the Koreans coming in right behind the Chinese. We often fail to acknowledge this, but the ceramics reveal that. They're such a good mirror of a particular civilization's level of technological achievement. In all fairness, we have to point out that the Japanese were able to produce high-fired ceramic wares. They simply didn't do Celadons. The Vietnamese did produce some Celadons, high-fired wares, in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, but the quality is not there. And so it's not quite the same, thing. But, and so when we think, oh yeah, the Koreans produce Celadons, the Chinese produce Celadons, step back, look at the bigger picture and think, oh yes, only those peoples in the entire world were able to do this, which is a great tribute. And when we think of China, as Anne Rose said, we speak of China as, ceramic ware as China today. The Chinese are being so accomplished that someone can produce things just as good as the Chinese. This is something that's very, very rare, and here we have the Koreans doing it. So at first, Koreans produced Celadons in the Chinese manner, that is technically, of course, but at first they are learning by imitating the Chinese, so they look something like Chinese Celadon wares. Carved decoration, incised decoration, but the very best Korean pieces, right from the beginning, often have a much stronger bluish-green hue than do the Chinese. It's not a technical difference. In this case, it's the fact that the Koreans are able to do it, but it's just a difference in aesthetic taste. The Koreans like this particular color, which really is a very, very beautiful color to the glaze. In addition, in contrast to the Chinese Celadons, in general, and one always has to put that caveat in there, in general, the Korean Celadon glaze is somewhat clearer. The Chinese glazes, probably by design, tend to be somewhat cloudy, so that there's a very subtle feel to the glaze. Koreans are often a very clear glaze, so it's very easy to see the incised, carved, or molded decoration through the glaze. Now, this is not a qualitative or a technical difference so much as it is probably an aesthetic difference. Here is a Maebyung in Korean, a Meiping in Chinese. They were not originally vases for the display of a cut branch of blossoming plum, as the name suggests. They were very elegant storage jars and would have had a cover to protect the contents, but also complementing and reversing the strong curves of the vessel. Here it's beautifully carved over the entire surface. Decoration sort of improbably of a phoenix, of which you're just seeing the tail there, flying through a floral arabesque. But it's a design that comes out of Chinese textile design and is simply picked up as ceramic decoration here. But it emphasizes the interrelationship of the various arts. You have the relationship between the bronze and the ceramics that we discussed in the Shang Dynasty. You have the influence of silver or lacquer or other metalwork on ceramic ware. You have influence of textiles in terms of decoration. Now, this is one of the most exquisitely carved works of celadon ware, whether from China or Korea, it doesn't matter. The Koreans excel in this kind of carving of the surface. Again, it's not that the Chinese couldn't do it, but the Koreans simply preferred pieces like this with just the most perfect carving that you could ever want in combination with the color. Of course, the little bits of damage here are just that. They're damaged. They're not original firing flaws, just a bit of a hard life over the centuries. The Koreans also do wonderful molded celadon ware. So once again, it's the standard celadon ware of light gray stoneware covered with a celadon glaze. But in the same way that we saw the use of the hump molds in China, the Koreans use hump molds as well. They tend to be floral designs, as they were in China, but slightly different approach to the design. This is one with a hibiscus decoration, so you have the leaves there, the flowers and such, and then a stylized chrysanthemum in the center of the piece. The molded pieces in Korea tend to be somewhat more, in general, more elaborate than those in China. But this is a very good example of the molded ware. But the most elaborate molded ware are pieces like this. There was a taste in Korea for the open work. We saw it in the pedestals of some of the Three Kingdom period pedestal cups. And when it's a decorative portion or a decorative panel as opposed to a container, this taste for open work will sometimes express itself as it does here and other related pieces. But this is a small brush holder for the scholar's desk. It's actually very small, only about 4 or 5 inches in length. But it means that if the scholar is finished with the brushes, or the painter, the brush could be stood upright, the head at the top and the handle coming down through one of those holes. On the other hand, if the artist or the calligrapher is alternating amongst brushes of various sizes, they could be laid diagonally, one here, another there. But the most important thing is just this wonderful piece for the scholar's desk in celadon ware with the molded dragon head ornaments over here, and then this openwork floral arabesque. A difficult thing to accomplish in the first place, but accomplished perfectly here and with such a beautiful glaze. Again, we seldom see this in China, not because the Chinese couldn't do it, but because there was very little taste for openwork decoration of the type that we see here in China. But the Koreans love to do it, and they do it with absolute perfection, as this piece reveals. Now, leaving that kind of open work and such behind, you'll remember the imperial ruleware in China that I said was produced in the first quarter of the 12th century. The Koreans learn about imperial ruleware, and they make pieces in that style as well. Tends to be undecorated, tends to have rather angular forms, as we see here. This is an example of ruleware on the left. This is a bottle originally probably had an everted lip that came out. It's been damaged and the damage concealed with a little metal band. Roux-ware is exceptionally rare. There are probably only 60 or 70 pieces extant today in the entire world, and so there were surely ewers of exactly this form. This is Korean. This probably imitates the form of a Chinese roux-ware ewer, but none survived. The reason that there are so few pieces of roux-ware, most kilns were active over many centuries. They produced large quantities of things, some for the palace, some for other use. The roux kilns produced exclusively for the imperial palace, so a very limited clientele, if you will. In addition, most kilns, as I said, were active for many decades, sometimes for centuries. The roux kilns really were active for only 25 years. It's not that they wanted to stop, but you'll remember I mentioned the Jin Tartars overran North China in 1127, causing the legitimate Chinese court to flee down to the Hangzhou area. That also brought an end to the production of roux-ware. So it's over a limited period of time, an exclusive clientele for the palace, but in addition, when the Chinese court fled down to the Hangzhou area, they weren't able to take all that roux-ware with them. The palaces were destroyed, and so most roux-ware was destroyed. So it's to say we have very few examples and can't give you an identical one to compare with this ewer. But you see from the sort of cylindrical sides, the emphasis on a long neck, the square corners, and the appearance of the glaze, the influence of the Chinese roux-ware on Korea. Now, if it's produced exclusively for the Chinese palace, how did the Koreans know about it? How did they have access to the best examples? Well, we can't know for sure, but we can guess. That is to say, the Chinese knew the Jin Tartars were coming. They had been bribing them for decades. The bribes were getting too heavy for them to continue. The Chinese were begging everyone around them for help. They sent an ambassador to the King of Korea, I think in 1121, 1122, something like that, begging for the help of the Korean armies to resist the Jin Tartars. You can imagine if the Chinese emperor is begging for help, the Chinese emperor is sending gold, silver, the very best roux-ware, silk, all kinds of things. And so the King of Korea probably gratefully received them and told his potters, hey, if the Emperor of China has that on his table, I want that on my table. And his potters were able to do it. And so we have things like this. Just to show you how that was used, it looks so plain with the undecorated sides and such. Of course, a ewer like that, whether in China in roux-ware or in Korea in Korean celadon ware, was meant to be set in a basin. It's a ewer either for warmed wine, and of course when we say wine, we're using the term generically, not grape wine, but perhaps something, some type of rice wine, perhaps something akin to beer, something like that, that was served warm, and you would put hot water in the basin to keep the contents of the ewer warm at the table. Alternatively, it might have been hot water in the ewer. Tea was not steeped at that time, but it was prepared much as it's prepared in the Japanese tea ceremony today, by taking a measured amount of powdered tea, putting it into the tea bowl, putting a little bit of water in, stirring it to make a paste, then putting more hot water in and whipping it to a froth with a small bamboo whisk. And so it could have been for warmed beverage, whether it's water, alcoholic beverage, something like that, but in a basin which concealed the otherwise undecorated sides, and any decoration that there was going to be would be focused on the cover, as you see there. Now, this is a famous, there are two bowls and two saucers. Whether they were separate, whether one sat on the other, we don't know. But in the Rockefeller collection in New York, these are Korean celadon ware from probably the middle of the 12th century. Here you see them separated. And my point is, of course, you'll remember the imperial roux-ware that I showed you from the Palace Museum in Taipei. The Korean piece is a direct copy of that. And consequently, the Emperor of China must have sent pieces like that to Korea, which were copied in Korea in Korean celadon ware. They're very close in form, in the thickness of the walls and things like that. The Korean glaze is a little more transparent, as I mentioned before. Put them side by side. This one will be a little more bluish green. Neither one is meant to have a crackle pattern. The guanware that I showed you with the very distinct crackle pattern is Chinese and comes a little bit later, but many types of ceramic ware form crackle patterns. That in roux-ware, when it forms, want it or not, tends to be a very fine fishnet kind of crackle. By contrast, in celadon ware, it's just the nature of the clay, The crackle, if it forms, tends to be the long lines that perhaps you can sense there in that piece. Now, once the Koreans had completely mastered Chinese-style celadons, even being able to copy the imperial ruleware, then, having mastered all of the Chinese techniques, they go on to develop modes of decoration that fit their own functional and aesthetic needs. So when you look at this, it is a maebyung vessel, a storage jar. It has an incised floral spray here, but look up here at the top. Suddenly something new and different, something we never saw in China before. That is decoration in black and white, wholly apart from the incised decoration there. We call this inlay. They probably stamped or carved the decoration there, and then in inlaying it, they inlaid it with black and white slips. Slip, you remember, is a clay that's been ground to a fine powder, mixed with water, and in this case, a coloring agent added to it. They fit it into the intaglio lines of a stamped or carved decoration. The celadon glaze goes over it, it's fired, and when it's finished, we read it in contrasting colors. Now, what is this? It's difficult to know. It's probably a little piece of fabric, a little textile. Perhaps originally, when the piece was in use, when it was first made and had its little cover, perhaps a textile was put over the top. And this is just imitating that little type of textile. The important thing in terms of its placement, this is early on in the inlay tradition. It's still experimental, if you will. And instead of using it for the principal decoration, they're using it for border decoration, trying it out. The principal decoration is still the traditional incised decoration. Now, of course, very quickly, they come to love the inlay. There's sort of two different styles in the inlay, if you will. Some of it is somewhat more abstract. I don't mean non-representational, but I mean instead of a grand pictorial composition, little flower heads, little chrysanthemum heads, as you see around here, is one type. And with the inlay, the ceramic inlay, again, the Chinese didn't do this, it's purely a Korean development. We don't know what inspired the potters to do this. They may have come up with it on their own. On the other hand, there's a great deal of inlaid lacquer produced in China and in Korea. In the Goryeo period in particular, and it might be that the lacquer inlaid with designs in mother of pearl sparked a desire to have inlaid designs in the celadon ware. When we look at the designs on inlaid lacquer, we see that a lot of them are the same kind of little inlaid chrysanthemum, little florets that you see there, as we see over there. So it might be an aesthetic correlation, or there might be an aesthetic and technical, we don't know. The other type of inlay, technically it's the same, but in terms of the design motifs, if there's that type that just emphasizes little flowers and such, another type is more pictorial. You have the grand willow tree here at the water's edge, a goose or a swan over there, butterflies and birds and things like that around. Obviously, it's inspired by painting on silk, although no such paintings survive, but related to it is the type of design that we see here of a Buddhist holy water vessel, bronze, which has been decorated with inlays in silver wire. And you see that the composition there is the willow tree, distant mountains, geese or swans in the water, and all kinds of birds and such over there. So certainly a pictorial relationship between the Buddhist water vessel and the ceramic maebyung, but whether or not there's a technical influence, the idea of inlaying in linear designs, we don't know. But the pictorial relationship, of course, is clear. But like I've said before, when one studies ceramics, in fact, when one studies any of the arts, one can look vertically to examine exactly how ceramics develop. But if you want to understand the full picture, you have to look horizontally as well. What else is happening at the same time? What is happening in metalwork? What's happening in lacquer? What's happening in textiles? What's happening in painting? And while we can't do all of that here, we can at least catch a glimpse of some of these relationships. Now, leaving those kinds of things behind, when we talk about the development of the inlay style, in the early developments of the inlay, once they move past limiting it to borders, in the late 12th and the beginning of the 13th century, we see that there's a very happy balance between decorated and undecorated areas. The cranes in flight, 2 little cloud heads, a little border, and the rest of it left undecorated. The same thing in this large jar in the collection of the National Museum of Korea in Seoul. The large peony spray here, another large peony spray on the other side. The rest of it undecorated. What we do find is in the early development of the inlay technique, you'll remember before this there had been molded decoration, incised decoration. We find some emphasis still with the old type of molding, not with the overall decorative pattern, but with the lion head handles that we see there, for example. Now, when we move from that early phase of development to a mature phase of development in the 13th century, the idea of a happy balance goes away because it's completely decorated, but very beautifully so. A little cosmetics box here, you see, has the circular chrysanthem florets there, and then the charming scene of these 2 cranes, I guess, with their necks intertwined here. Like some of the Chinese wares, they're interested in glazing the piece as fully as possible, so they've even glazed the base, and they have set it on these little stilts, if you will, which we call spurs, which elevated above the sagger, the ceramic container in which it was fired, so that it isn't fused to the sagger. Now, of course, anything that touches it when the glaze melts is going to be fused to it, so they have to break the spurs away, and we call them spur marks. But if you want the base glazed, there's really no other way to do it other than that. Now, in the 13th century, not only was that piece fully glazed, but when we look at this wonderful piece, which is often referred to as a 1,000-crane vase for obvious reasons, we see that it too, once again, is fully embellished with cranes, ascending cranes in roundels and descending cranes and clouds in the interstices. But quite a magnificent piece. And we won't go into any kind of detailed discussion of the evolution of the style, but these make it very clear that as time progresses, decoration evolves from the simpler type of design, overall composition, to the bolder design that we see here. This is a magnificent piece in the Jordan Schnitzer Museum. I'm not sure. The slides actually fit on the computer. There's some little misregistration between the computer and the projector, and it cuts off the right edge of many slides and cuts off the bottom edge. My point is, I actually did say Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art, and I can show you on my computer screen. It's there. Anyway, it's in the Schnitzer Museum, and this is one of our great discoveries. Well, Ann Rose knew about the piece, but we're really beginning to push and publicize it here. Now, technically, this is the same as the others that we've been seeing. That is, it's inlaid decoration. But what is different here, this is what we call reverse inlay. With the other pieces, like these, for example, it is the motif itself that has been inlaid with slip, leaving the background without any inlay so that you read it as green because of the glaze. Here, it's the background that has been inlaid, leaving the foliate pattern in green. And so it makes a very bold, very striking, very dramatic kind of design. But in addition, in terms of logical description, quote unquote, it adds a note of descriptive color because you're seeing foliage, leaves, stems, flowers, this and that, in green, as opposed to black or white, against an embellished ground. But just this kind of bold decorative scheme is wonderful. This is a very, very rare type of piece. There's another example, almost identical. Unfortunately, I don't have a slide of it, but I will get one to compare with this one. But it's in the National Museum of Korea in Seoul. But these pieces with principal decoration, as opposed to a little subsidiary band on the exterior or something, but the ones with reverse inlay in the principal band are very rare, and this was such a tremendous find here. I have to say that when I saw the poster that Ann Rose and her colleagues put together for my lecture, I was terrified, thinking, that can't be real. It just can't be real, please. And then I got here, and I was so happy and so thrilled to see that not only is it beautiful and real, genuine, but it's in excellent condition. And here it is. But this is tremendous.
So, Bob, I hate to do this to you, but I think this is officially the time we were supposed I
Oh.
would love to hear you go on, but I am not sure that we have technical assistance after this moment. So,
Okay, I'll just run through a couple more slides without saying anything. This is black inlay. They begin to produce porcelain inspired by the Chinese, same shapes as the Celadons. In the late Courtier period, they begin to produce blue and white ware, Chinese style. There you go. In the 16th, 17th century, they often use underglaze iron. The tradition, by choice, never becomes as colorful in Korea as in China. It's simply a more austere aesthetic. There is a close relationship between ink painting and ceramic decoration in Korea. There is less emphasis on covering the entire vessel with the porcelain pieces, unlike the Chinese pieces. See how different that aesthetic is? No borders. It is a balanced but asymmetrical arrangement. Once again, very close relationship with contemporaneous painting on paper and silk. They use underglaze copper red. The aesthetic is for this kind of austere, plain, unlike what we got in China. When they do blue and white, it's very sparse. The relationship with painting again, much more so than in China. And this is Korean blue and white at its best from the 18th century. And there, we finished.
thank